In 1781, a single battalion turned the tide of the American Revolution and won the war for independence. Without them, there would be no United States of America. But here's what they don't teach you. Nearly half of them were black. And after they bled for freedom, America erased their names, denied them citizenship, and sold their children back into slavery. The year is 1775 and the American colonies are in chaos. The Revolutionary War has just begun. And if you believed what they taught you in school, you'd think it was a noble fight led by wealthy white landowners fighting for liberty. But the truth is far messier, far more desperate, and far more revealing about what America really was. George Washington's Continental Army was falling apart. Men were deserting by the hundreds. Disease ravaged the camps. The British had the world's most powerful navy, professional soldiers trained in European warfare, and resources that made the colonists look like children playing at war. The revolution was on the verge of collapse before it even began. Washington needed bodies. He needed soldiers. He needed anyone willing to fight. But there was a problem. At this exact moment in history, nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans were living in the 13 colonies. They built the roads, harvested the crops, constructed the buildings, and generated the wealth that made the revolution even possible. And they had no freedom, no rights, no future. They were property. But both sides in this war saw an opportunity in their desperation. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation that sent shock waves through the colonies. Any enslaved person who escaped their master and joined the British forces would be granted their freedom. It was a military strategy, not a moral awakening. The British didn't suddenly care about black liberation. They wanted to weaken the colonial economy and gain soldiers. But for thousands of enslaved people, it didn't matter why the offer was made. It was a chance at freedom and they took it. Thousands of black men, women, and children fled plantations and ran toward British lines. They risked everything. If they were caught, they'd be tortured, sold away from their families, or killed. But they ran anyway. The British formed them into units like the Ethiopian Regiment. And suddenly the Continental Army had a crisis on its hands. The slaveholding patriots panicked. If the British kept recruiting black soldiers, the entire Southern economy would collapse. Plantation owners demanded action. But there was a deeper fear lurking beneath the economic argument. They were terrified of armed black men. They were terrified of what it would mean if enslaved people realized they could fight back. So for the first 2 years of the war, Washington and the Continental Congress refused to officially enlist black soldiers. But desperation has a way of changing minds. By 1777, the Continental Army was hemorrhaging soldiers. Enlistment numbers were collapsing. Entire regiments were down to skeleton crews. The northern states, which had smaller enslaved populations and were bearing the brunt of the fighting, started to crack. Rhode Island, facing a quota it couldn't fill with white men alone, made a radical decision. In February 1778, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed a law that allowed enslaved men to enlist in the Continental Army in exchange for their freedom. Their masters would be compensated by the state. It was transactional, cold, and pragmatic. But for the men who enlisted, it was everything. Over 200 black men joined what became known as the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. They were told they were fighting for liberty. They were told they'd be free. They believed it. But belief and reality were two very different things. From the moment the regiment formed, it was treated as inferior. The black soldiers were given outdated muskets, threadbare uniforms, and less pay than their white counterparts. Southern representatives in Congress were furious that the unit even existed. Slaveholders complained. Newspapers mocked the idea of black patriots. Even some Northern officers expressed disgust at the thought of serving alongside former slaves. And this is where the erasure began. Not after the war, not decades later, but immediately. While these men were still alive, still fighting, their contributions were being minimized, their names left out of reports, their existence treated as an embarrassing necessity rather than a point of pride. History wasn't being written, it was being curated, and black soldiers were being edited out in real time. Then came August 29, 1778, the Battle of Rhode Island. This is the moment that should be taught in every history class in America, but most people have never heard of it. British forces, supported by Hessian mercenaries, launched a massive assault to crush the American retreat from Newport. The Continental Army was surrounded, outnumbered, and in full danger of being annihilated. If they were destroyed here, the revolution in the North would be finished. Washington ordered a retreat, but someone had to hold the line. Someone had to buy time for the rest of the army to escape. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment was sent forward. These men, many of whom had been enslaved just months earlier, were now being asked to stand between the Continental Army and total destruction. And they did. For 4 hours, the black soldiers of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment fought off 3 separate charges by elite Hessian troops. Bayonets clashing in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Musket fire tearing through the air. Blood soaking into the soil. Men fell but the line held. They didn't retreat. They didn't break. They saved the Continental Army. One officer wrote in his diary that the Black Regiment fought with desperate valor. Another observed that their defense was the best fought action of the entire war. But when the official reports were sent to Congress, when the dispatches were written up for newspapers, something strange happened. The race of the soldiers was conveniently omitted. They were just listed as Rhode Island troops. The story was sanitized. The truth was softened. The erasure continued. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment didn't stop there. They fought in nearly every major battle in the Northern Theater for the rest of the war. They were at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781 when Lord Cornwallis surrendered and the United States won its independence. They were there. They fought. They bled. They survived. And when the war ended, they waited for their promised freedom. But here's where the betrayal becomes unforgivable. After the war, after victory, after independence was secured, many of the black soldiers who fought for the Continental Army were denied their freedom. Slaveholders from the South demanded their property be returned. Some soldiers were re-enslaved. Others were given no land, no pension, no compensation. The country they had saved didn't want to acknowledge them. George Washington himself, the man lionized as the father of the nation, personally returned enslaved soldiers to their masters as part of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Men who had fought under his command. Men who had risked everything for a revolution built on the idea that all men are created equal. He gave them back to bondage because political unity with slaveholders was more important than honoring promises made to black patriots. And in Rhode Island, the very state that had freed these men to fight, new laws were quietly passed that ensured the children of black soldiers could still be born into slavery. The promise of freedom had fine print. It had conditions. It had limits. And those limits were always designed to protect white supremacy. But the cruelest act of all was the erasure. Within a generation, the story of black soldiers in the Revolution was being systematically scrubbed from American memory. Textbooks didn't mention them. Paintings of famous battles depicted only white soldiers. Monuments and statues honored white generals and white heroes. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment was quietly disbanded, its records scattered, its soldiers forgotten. By the 1800s, the dominant narrative of the American Revolution was one of white patriots fighting for freedom against British tyranny. Black contributions were reduced to footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. And this wasn't an accident. This was a choice, a deliberate, coordinated effort to rewrite history in a way that justified slavery, that upheld white supremacy, that erased the uncomfortable truth that America owed its very existence to people it refused to see as human. Here's what they don't teach you. At least 5,000 black soldiers fought in the Continental Army. Another 20,000 fought for the British, seeking the freedom that the Patriots refused to give them. In some northern regiments, black soldiers made up 25% of the fighting force. They were at Bunker Hill. They were at Saratoga. They were at Trenton. They were at Yorktown. Without black soldiers, there would be no United States of America. And for 200 years their names were deleted. Their stories were suppressed. Their sacrifices were dismissed as irrelevant. It wasn't until the 1990s that historians began to seriously recover these erased narratives. Gravestones were discovered in forgotten cemeteries. Pension records were unearthed in dusty archives. Descendants began speaking up, sharing family stories that had been passed down in whispers because the official history had no room for them. In 2002, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was finally honored with a monument 2 centuries too late. 200 years after these men had fought and died and been erased, the monument stands now, a quiet admission that history got it wrong. But monuments don't undo erasure. They don't bring back the soldiers who died without recognition. They don't heal the generational trauma of being written out of your own country's founding story. This isn't just about forgotten heroes. This is about a system, a deliberate, calculated system of historical erasure designed to maintain a lie. The lie that America was built by white people alone. The lie that black people were passive victims of history rather than active agents of change. The lie that freedom was a gift given by benevolent founders rather than a right fought for and won by people of all colors. History isn't neutral. It's written by those in power. And for generations those in power chose to hide the truth. They chose to protect a narrative that justified slavery, segregation, and systemic racism. They chose to erase black soldiers because acknowledging their contributions would have undermined the entire ideology of white supremacy. If black men could fight as bravely as white men, if they could save the Continental Army, if they could win independence for a nation, then how could anyone justify treating them as property? But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't stay buried forever. It resurfaces. It breaks through the cracks. It demands to be heard. And now, more than 2 centuries later, we're finally beginning to tell the full story of the American Revolution. We're finally saying the names that were erased. Private Cato Howe, Sergeant Prince Bent, Corporal Caesar Tarrant, and hundreds more whose names we'll never know because the records were destroyed or never kept in the first place. These men didn't fight for glory. They didn't fight because they were naive about what America was. They knew. They knew they were fighting for a country that enslaved them, that saw them as less than human, that would likely betray them the moment the war was over. But they fought anyway. They fought because freedom was worth dying for, even if the country they were defending refused to give it to them. They fought because they believed in a principle that America itself didn't yet believe in. That all people deserve liberty. They saved a nation that erased them. But we won't. We remember. We tell their stories. We honor their sacrifice. Because history belongs to everyone. And the truth, no matter how long it's been buried, will always find its way back to the